Have you ever felt like you're over your head? Anybody ever felt like you're over your head? Yeah. I remember being in high school. It's funny because all our kids up to this point have all taken physics. And when I was in high school, I didn't need physics, but I thought it would be fun. So I took physics, and by week 3, I was way over my head. I mean, way over my head. I fought my way through the year, kind of. And by the time I took my Regents test at the very end of the year, I got a 64. Can you believe that? The only class I didn't pass in high school was physics. But I felt like I was completely over my head. I mean, formulas now, if I see a formula, it just makes no sense to me. Letters should never be allowed into the whole mathematical system. It's just, right? Like, it was just over my head. All right, so the reason I say that is because today I hope we don't get over your head. When we decided to go through the book of Hebrews, I read the whole thing this summer through the book, and I thought, man, this is great. I love this. This is amazing. But as we start to break it down and I start to go, okay, this is great, but now I actually have to explain it to people, that's a whole different thing. So now I'm at the point where, so we get to the point of the book where we're reading stuff that you go, what? What? What are they talking about? What are these things? Who are these people? And it becomes more difficult. So what's been cool is I hope you've learned something as we've been going through Hebrews. But at the same time, I'm learning things that I never knew as well. So today, as we talk about the book of Hebrews, I mean, the overarching reason we're doing Hebrews is so we can discover the supremacy of Christ. Discover the supremacy of Christ. And I don't know if you realize this or not, but the graphics we're even using today and throughout the series, that sign right there, what kind of a symbol is that? It's a greater than sign, right? So the whole idea of Hebrews is that Jesus is greater than. Greater than what? Greater than anything. Greater than anybody. Greater than any system. Greater than any organization. Jesus is greater. And the author spends time, just verse after verse, spending time saying Jesus is greater. He starts off, Jesus is greater than the angels. He goes, Jesus is greater than Moses. Jesus is greater than Abraham. He talks about how Jesus is greater than all these things that the Jews at that point thought were great. And so the author is speaking to these Hebrews, most of them who have recently become Christians, or they've been Christians for a few years. And so the author of Hebrews is writing to Christians because some of them are starting to question their faith. Some of them are looking back towards what they did have in the sacrificial system of the Jews and all that kind of stuff, and they're looking back at it, and some of them are questioning, should we really still be following this Jesus guy, or should we go back to what we've always known? And I think in a lot of places in our life, we kind of get that place. Should we just go back to what we're used to and where we're comfortable, or is God calling us to continue to move forward in our faith? That's what we're talking about today, and that's what the book of Hebrews is about. I was recently watching a Netflix series called The 60s. I don't know if you've seen it or not. So now you're like, gosh, this guy likes talking about biblical stuff, then he watches documentaries, right? Like, yeah, that's me. But this documentary on the 60s is fascinating. And as I was watching it, there's one whole episode on the space race. And the Soviet Unions are putting astronauts into space, and we're trying to catch up, and the whole drama of that thing rolling out. And as I was watching this whole thing about the space race, they get to the point where we're actually going to try to land somebody on the moon. Never been done before. Weren't sure how it was going to work completely. I mean, they had everything kind of calculated, but the landing on the moon was extremely, extremely big event for our country. And probably most people, if you're alive at the time that, we landed on the moon, you probably remember it. And you may remember exactly where you were because people were glued to TVs all over the nation and really all over the world seeing, is America really going to land a person on the moon? And it's interesting because we just had a supermoon, right? And if you look at that, you go, wow, there's somebody standing on that, 40 years ago or whatever. That's just, it kind of blows your mind. I mean, to the point where we're always saying things like, we can put a man on the moon, but we can't get this line in the supermarket to move faster, right? We say things like that, right? Because it is truly amazing that we even did that, right? But this one part is where Neil Armstrong is coming out of the spacecraft, and he's going to step onto the moon, and he says this famous line, right? It's this one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And when that happened, then I'm watching it, and, Walter Cronkite, I don't know if you remember him. Some of you remember Walter Cronkite. He's the guy who's like kind of narrating this whole thing, and everybody's watching it. I mean, and I'm like, I know, it sounds so lame. I'm watching a documentary in the 60s. I'm on the edge of my seat, like, is it going to work? Is it going to, he's going to land on them, right? And it was just very exciting. And I'm thinking, wow, like, so, and here's what he did. When he said that, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and he's stepping on the moon, and they leave an American flag up there, to some degree, we all were on the moon. I mean, none of us have traveled to the moon, but a representative from this world went to the moon as a representative of who we are. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, because I was thinking about that in terms of what we are doing now, and it's similar to what a priest does in the system of the Jewish system back in the Old Testament. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because it's important to understand when we go into what we're talking about today, you understand what it means to have a representative go before you and stand before you and kind of be your ambassador, kind of like what the astronauts did going to the moon. So here's the thing. It's similar to the priests of the Old Testament. Here's what a high priest of Israel kind of looked like, that we think that they look like. And everything that priest is wearing has significance. So, if you can read down through all the things, like on the priest's breastplate, there's 12 stones that represent the 12 tribes in the Bible. We'll talk about the 12 tribes a little bit in a minute. But so he's representing the 12 tribes. He's basically standing in for the people, and he's sacrificing things for the people. All the people cannot fit in the temple, so they send a representative. They send a priest. And in this case, the high priest was one of the most, the highest people in the ranks of how the Jewish system worked back then. So as we talk about this, the high priest represented the people. He would enter the temple on the people's behalf. And in a way, the high priest is a picture of Jesus Christ. Now, if you came out of Catholicism, you may be like, oh, okay, we were talking about priests in church. What's going on? I left the Catholic Church. But the priestly system that we came out of is very important to understand what Jesus does for us in the context in which we live. And so as we talk about the priestly system, it'll maybe help you understand today a little bit better on how this whole thing bridged from the Old Testament to the New Testament, how we got from there to where we are today. So this is going to be a little bit complex. I'm just going to tell you that right up front, okay? It's going to be a little complex. I'm going to do my best to explain it to you. But to be honest, do I understand it 100%? I don't even know if I understand it 100%. It's complex. But we're going to go into it, and I hope you come out with an idea of why we even need high priests back in the Old Testament, and how Jesus is kind of like our representative today. So essentially, Jesus Christ is the only one who is able to represent us to God. That's kind of where our theology comes from. That Jesus is our mediator between us and God. And in order to get to God, you have to go through a mediator, which is Jesus Christ. You can't just go and stand before God on your own, because you couldn't last. You're sinful. I'm sinful. Sinful people cannot stand in the presence of a holy God. So we have somebody who represents us. And that representative is Jesus. So Timothy was this young guy, this young minister in the Bible who was kind of being mentored by the Apostle Paul. And here's what Timothy writes about this idea of a high priest and an ambassador. Timothy writes, "For there is only one God and one mediator who can" what? "Reconcile God and humanity." There's only one. There's only one mediator. There's only one who can reconcile God and humanity. It's the man, Jesus Christ. He gave his life to purchase freedom for everyone. So Timothy's saying, we do have this mediator. And so again, it's the same kind of language. It's a mediator. It's an ambassador. It's a representative who goes before us. So as we see this throughout the book of Hebrews. So if you read the book of Hebrews in one sitting, you see this theme. It stands out pretty strong. But as you read little verses and go through the Bible, or you go through the book of Hebrews, you don't see it as much. So we're just going to kind of quickly walk through where this high priest theme runs through Hebrews. So go back to chapter 2. Here's what the writer says. "For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful" what? "High priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people." All right, so that's starts out in chapter 2 talking about the high priest. Chapter 3, picture thoughts on Jesus, whom we acknowledge as our apostle and high priest. On to chapter 4, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, our great high priest, let us hold firmly to the faith we possess. Chapter 5, in the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest. Are you getting the theme? Right? So if we pick up, so this theme of Jesus as our high priest is all through Hebrews. It's extremely obvious once you read it as a whole book. You start to go, Jesus is our high priest. And maybe today you're sitting there going, I've never thought of Jesus as my high priest before. But it's a good thing he is. And so as we read through this, I want you to just think about how this actually works out in your life. But he is a different kind of priest, and he's from a different kind of priesthood. And that's where we're going to get a little bit, we have to kind of break that apart a little bit so we can understand what the author's talking about. So in chapter 6, where we left off last week, here's what we left off with. Where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf, he has become a high priest forever in the order of, Melchizedek. Okay, so the first thing you might say, now, if this is your first time here, I just apologize, okay? Because this is going to be I'm just really this is going to be complex, right? And I'm thinking you're leave here going, this church over in Penfield, it's like talking about Melchizedek and high priest. It is whacked out, right? But just hang on. I think we'll get there, okay? But it is a little complex. So you're going, Melchizedek, okay. First we're talking about high priest, now we're talking about Melchizedek, You're going, who the heck is Melchizedek, right? That's what you're thinking. So here's the thing about Melchizedek. He's only mentioned 10 times in the entire Bible. His name is only listed 10 times. 8 of those times, it's in the book of Hebrews. 8 times Melchizedek is listed in the book of Hebrews. He's only listed, his name only shows up once in Genesis, and then it shows up one more time as just a reference in one verse of one psalm. That's it. His name is listed 10 times in the Bible. And so if you've never heard about him or you don't know much about him, well, it's totally understandable because there's very little written about him. And in the book of Genesis, there's only 3 verses that reference him. And it's this little scenario with Abraham. And so we're kind of just going to go back and read through these 3 verses so you can go, okay, who is Melchizedek? I'm going to give you all there is to know about Melchizedek in 3 little verses found in Genesis. So if you have your Bible, you can turn to Genesis chapter 14, or if you have your phone, you can go to it, or iPad or whatever. Genesis 14, starting with verse 18, here's what the Bible says about Melchizedek. Now Abraham, all right, Abraham is, again, he's one of the pillars of the Jewish faith. He was, Lot had gotten taken from him and captured by these kings. Abraham gathered up all his guys that were considered a little army and went and rescued Lot and defeated these kings. Abraham comes back, and he comes back to this place. He returned from this place, and he's hanging out in this place called the King's Valley after this big war, after he just conquered all these kings. He's back in King's Valley, and it says this. Then Melchizedek, again, this is just kind of out of the blue. It just starts. Verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine out into this King's Valley. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, now remember, Abram is the same guy as Abraham, right? His name was changed. We're talking about the same person. He blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him how much? A tenth of everything. This is the very first mention of a tenth or a tithe. Abram gives Melchizedek a tenth of all the spoils that he got from war. That's a lot. And to this guy who just shows up out of nowhere in this one scene. After this verse, Melchizedek is never heard from again until David writes about him in one verse in the Psalms. And then the author of Hebrews starts going Melchizedek crazy 8 times, right? In the same book, like Melchizedek, right? So you might be going, all right, so what does this mean? So this guy shows up. He brings bread and wine to Abram. He blesses Abram. And then Abram gives him a tenth of all his spoils. And then he disappears. And the author of Hebrews thinks this is very, very significant. So you have to go, okay, so what's the big deal? But clearly Abraham affirmed the priesthood of Melchizedek, or he wouldn't have given him a tenth of all his stuff. So he was showing honor to him in some way. He was showing him, hey, you're important. And he's kind of tithing to this guy. He's giving him a tenth of what he owns. To go, well, why? Well, the author of Hebrews repeats this brief encounter in the book of Hebrews. So that's where we pick up today. Hebrews chapter 7, starting with verse 1, he kind of recapitulates this little scenario. This Melchizedek was king of the city of Salem and also a priest of who? So he knows that he was a priest of God. When Abraham was returning home after winning a great battle against the kings, Melchizedek met him and blessed him. Then Abraham took a tenth of all he had captured in battle and gave it to Melchizedek. So that's what happened. But then he offers a little bit more information that we didn't have in the first account. And so he goes on in verse 2 to say this. The name Melchizedek means king of what? Justice. And king of Salem means king of peace. So those are some things we didn't know from Genesis. His name means king of justice and king of peace. Then he goes on in verse 3, continuing with this kind of theme, talking about Melchizedek. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the who? The Son of God, so resembling Jesus. He continues a priest for how long? Forever. All right, this is where your head starts to hurt, right? So you're like, he doesn't have a father or mother, and then your immediate thoughts are probably like, Anakin Skywalker didn't have a dad, did he? Right? Like, right? So you're trying to think about this, right? Jesus didn't have he had like a dad kind of like, but you're trying to think about people who actually didn't have a mother, and this gets confusing. How does Melchizedek not have a mom and dad, and he has no genealogy, and he's going to be a priest forever? What does that even mean? I have no idea. I have no idea what that means. I don't really know. I mean, and the thing is, this is controversial because it's so obscure that you're kind of like, what is he really talking about? Who is this guy? What we know is this. Abraham, so he was a real person. He had flesh and blood. He probably did have some kind of genealogy, but it's not written down anywhere. We don't really know how he became a priest of God Most High because he wasn't really part of what was happening in the Old Testament. So he kind of shows up. He does this role with this thing with Abram, and then he disappears. But the author of Hebrews thinks that's really important. This whole Melchizedek business is basically this. It's to encourage the Hebrews who have left their faith, the Jewish faith, and have followed Jesus. Some of them may be saying, oh, we miss the days where, priest so-and-so would baptize our child. We want to go back to that temple. And the author of Hebrews is saying, no, don't do it. Don't go back to your old ways. Move forward with Jesus. And here's why. He's going to say, let me show you, because Jesus is far greater than the priesthood. Jesus is far greater than the temple you came from. Jesus is far greater than even Abraham. Jesus is far greater than everything. So why would you leave the greatest thing ever known to people and go back to your old ways? Why would you ever do that? And then he says, I'm going to show you how great Jesus is. So it goes into this kind of argument. So Abraham, and this is the thing, Abraham is a big shot in the Bible. I mean, Abraham is one of the towering, formative pillar people in the Old Testament. I mean, he was a main character in the story of God. And so in Hebrews 7, here's what the writer writes in 7 verse 4. See how great this man was, Melchizedek, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. So the first thing he says is this. This is the first part of the Hebrew writer's argument. He's not as good as Abraham. I mean, he's better than Abraham because Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils to him. So Melchizedek must have been a greater person because you don't give a tenth of whatever to somebody who's not greater than you. You'd never do that. So you have Abraham giving Melchizedek 10%, and the whole principle is that the lesser gives to the greater. So Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. I know. You're going, okay. Some of you are probably like, okay, how does this apply to my life, right? You're probably saying that at this point. We've got to keep moving forward. So here we go. Verse 5, we continue. Now the law of Moses required that the priests who are descendants of who? Yeah, we talked about Levi a tiny bit, just I mentioned them last week. But we have to go back to that same little diagram that I wrote, or that I drew up, okay? So you have this kind of, these are the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. They had Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, and then Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and the 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the sons' names was Judah, and Jesus is a direct descendant from the line of Judah. Now, you may know some of the other of these 12. I mean, they all kind of look similar up here, right? But they're different people represented here, okay? So you have Judah there, and you may not recognize the guy next to him. That's Joseph, right, with the Technicolor coat. And there's other people in here you can't recognize. There's one there. See that guy in the end? He's wearing the 501s, right? That is Levi right there. So Levi is important because here's what God did with these 12 tribes. When they started going through the desert and they started setting up this temple system, and God started giving them instructions on how to sacrifice animals, and also, he said, somebody's got to do the work in the temple. We need some people to do this work. They need to set up the temple. They need to run this. They need to sacrifice these things. They need to light candles at certain times. They need to do all this temple work. Who are we going to get to do that? So for some reason, God said, I'm going to take the tribe of Levi, called the Levites, and those guys are going to be separated from everybody else. They're going to be my priests. So in order to be a priest in Israel, you can't just be whatever you want to be in Israel. You have roles to play. And so in order to be a priest, the only way you can do it is you have to be born into the family of Levi. If you're not born into the family of Levi, it doesn't matter how good a priest you could ever be, you're not going to be one because you weren't born to the right family. So if you're born to the family of Levites, you became a priest. And that's why this is important, right? Because you take this whole thing and say, okay, so all the priests had to be Levites. But now you're saying that Melchizedek is not part of them. Melchizedek wasn't a Levite. So how does he fit into this whole thing if he's not part of the Levites? So let's go back to the verse we just read. Now the law of Moses required that priests who are descendants of who? Levi must collect a tithe from the rest of the people of Israel, who are also descendants of Abraham. So the Levites basically survived by the tithes of everybody else. Everybody in all the other 11 tribes gave 10% of what they had to the priest, and the priest lived off that because they didn't go out and hunt and do all the other kinds of work. Their work was in the temple. So in order for it to be supported, God said everybody else gives 10% to make sure that the temple's running. But Melchizedek, who was what? Not a descendant of Levi, collected a tenth from Abraham. And the Jews are listening to this going, yeah. This doesn't make sense, right? Because Levites are the ones who get the 10%, not some guy who comes out of nowhere named Melchizedek. But all of a sudden, Melchizedek is giving Abraham, or is given by Abraham 10% of Abraham's stuff. So Abraham is tithing to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is not even a Levite. So if you're a Jew reading this, you might be like, yeah, this is a little messed up. So the writer continues his argument, though. And Melchizedek placed a what? A blessing upon Abraham. So he blessed Abraham, the one who had already received the promises of God. Abraham's the guy that God took out into the night and said, see the stars in the sky, Abraham? I'm going to make your descendants greater than all those people in the sky. I promise you that your descendants are going to be innumerable, and kings will be in your descendants. And you're going to have this amazing lineage. That's Abraham. That was the promise that Abraham received. But then Abraham, who's this formidable figure in the Old Testament, is now giving his 10% tithe to this other guy. So the Hebrew author's argument is Melchizedek must be greater than Abraham because Abraham is tithing to him. Do you see the argument? Does that make sense? Okay? So, and in verse 7 he says, and without question, the person who has the power to what? Give a blessing is what? Greater than the one who is blessed. So not only does he get a 10% of Abraham's stuff, but then he blesses Abraham, so he must be greater. Whew, how you doing out there? Does this make sense so far? Okay, hopefully it does. So basically, here's this, and this is where I'm going to show you some math. All right, I'm going to show you some math today. I know I told you I'm not good at math, but this is the kind of math that I do, okay? This is the math. Math is this. Melchizedek is what? Greater than, you got it. See, you guys are math whizzes too. Greater than Abraham. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. That's the first argument, and that's important to remember. So here's the thing. We go on to verse 9. In addition, we might even say that these Levites, all those priests, the ones who collected the tithe, paid a tithe to Melchizedek when their ancestor Abraham paid a tithe to him. How could they do that? They weren't even around. For although Levi wasn't born yet, the seed from which he came was in Abraham's body when Melchizedek collected the tithe from him. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Right? So it's almost saying the Levites gave tithe to Melchizedek too, because they were kind of inside of Abraham when Abraham gave the tithe to Melchizedek. So now we go into a complex formula, right? Here's the complex formula. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, and Abraham is what? Greater than Levi. So who's at the top of this chain right now? Melchizedek, yeah. Melchizedek's at the top of this chain. So here he's building this argument step by step, right? And here he's going. So the point that the author's trying to make is this, that Jesus is greater than Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, and Abraham is greater than Levi, but the top dog of all is not Abraham or Melchizedek, it's Jesus. And I actually learned something this week. I learned there's something actually greater than greater than. And if you are involved with math, you probably know this. I never knew this before. There's actually something that's greater than greater than. And that means it's magnified, right? So Jesus is not just greater than Melchizedek. He's greater than Melchizedek, far above Melchizedek. And so don't go back to your old temple sacrifice and go back to all the Jewish customs and go back to your old temple and go back to your old priest. Don't do that, because you'll be giving up that for the greatest thing of all, which is Jesus Christ, who is the high priest over everything. He's the author. He's the creator. He is that much greater. And if we jump forward to verse 25, the author writes this, which this is great. Therefore, Jesus is able to save what? Completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to what? To intercede for them. So it gives this picture of Jesus, that Jesus is kind of praying for us. Do you like to be prayed for? I do. When you're going through something difficult, don't you want people praying for you? And when they pray for you, don't you feel better because you know that now somebody is advocating for you? Somebody is going to the Father for you and saying, God, I want you to do something in this person's life. Well, Jesus is your intercessor. He is interceding for you all the time to the Father. He's up there as our high priest pleading your case. And every time you mess up, and every time you sin, and every time you do something you shouldn't do, Jesus is saying, he's saying to the Father, no, he's mine, she's mine, it's okay, look to me, don't look to them, because I am the high priest, and I am representing them. Don't look at them, look at me. It's kind of like almost like a courtroom scene where you have somebody who's representing somebody else. They do all the talking, right? The person just sits there, and their advocate talks for them. So as you're thinking about this, what does this all mean, right? Jesus is able to save completely. Priests could not save completely, right? Priests could not. They could give you a blessing. They could forgive your sin temporarily, but it's only temporary because you're going to sin again, and then they're going to have to forgive you again. And so the old system was always a repetitive thing of always getting more forgiveness and always going back and always repenting again. But this new system says that Jesus can save completely. So that's why Jesus is greater. So here's the bottom line. It's this, that Christ represents us before God. He represents us as our advocate. He represents us as our intercessor, means he's praying for you. He represents us as our mediator, which means he's arguing your case before God. And he represents us as our high priest. Let's see what John has to say, because John was one of the closest people to Jesus, and he knew all about Jesus because he spent 3 years with this guy, one of his best friends. Here's what John writes about Jesus. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have what? An advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. So what you got to understand is this is not just a Hebrew thing. This is not just the author of Hebrews going off on some tangent. Other writers in the New Testament agree with this and understand this concept. And so it's important for us to understand this concept because Jesus mediates for us. And it really brings us right back to where we started today and where we actually left off last week, which is Hebrews 6, 19, and 20. We have this hope. What hope? The hope that Jesus is our high priest. We have this hope as a what? As an anchor for the soul. It's firm. It's secure. It enters the inner sanctuary trying to get you off the hook because he loves you. He has brought you into the fold, and he's saying, I am not going to let this one go. And when you have somebody advocating for you, if you've ever been in a position where you felt like you're in a negotiation or you're in some kind of situation, you feel like you're above your head, when somebody comes in who knows what they're doing and takes over and starts arguing for you, how do you feel? You feel like, thank God somebody knows what they're doing here, right? Because I have no idea, right? But this person comes in and they start taking over, and you feel like, finally somebody understands this. Finally somebody can help me, right? It's like finally getting a representative on the phone who not only speaks English, but is going to try to help you, right? I mean, like, you get an advocate. And once you get an advocate, you feel like, okay, things are going to be okay now. Jesus is your advocate. He is our high priest. And this whole idea of the anchor for our soul is that we have this hope that's inside of us. It anchors us and keeps us from blowing back and forth. When the storms of life hit and you get a bad diagnosis at the doctor, or you have some terrible thing happen to you, or you have a death in your family, or whatever happens, when the storms of life hit, that this hope that you have in Jesus is so strong and so firm and so secure, you're not moving because you are anchored to Christ. The anchor is super important. In fact, it was very, very important even back in the ancient world, and we know this because we've found things, right? We found things that Christians used to use the anchor as one of their symbols. So you have the fish symbol, right? The ichthus, you see that all over the place. You don't see this as much, though, right? You see an anchor on tattooed on somebody, you think they're a sailor, right? But Christians had anchors all over the place, right? Because they kept on reminding themselves, even though life is bad, I'm anchored to Christ. Even though things are happening to me, I'm being persecuted, I'm anchored to Christ. And the author of Hebrews is saying, don't let go of the anchor. Don't cut loose from the anchor. Hold tight to what you believe, even when you go through storms, even when life goes rough, even when you get depressed, even when things don't go your way and you lose your job and you don't have enough money and you don't even know what tomorrow holds. You hold steady. Because our hope is not in what we can see and feel and touch and know. Our hope is in something far greater than that. Our hope lies with Christ, who anchors our soul. And we can never be shaken because of that. Do you have that anchor today? Here's a quote from Stephen Cole. I love this quote. It's great. The certain hope of our future salvation is an anchor to steady our souls while we wait upon God in present storms. If you aren't in a storm now, one is coming. They happen all the time. What happens to you in that storm is directly dependent on how firm your anchor is. Do you believe in that anchor? Or is it just something you talk about? Are you truly anchored to Christ? How much hope do you have? There's a story about a guy who went over to Russia, and he's with a group of Russians, and he's trying to be inconspicuous. So he's trying his best to not be seen, right? I mean, we tried this all summer. We went to New York City, and I don't like being seen as a tourist, right? I've got a camera hanging around my neck, right? I mean, I look like a tourist, but you don't want to be seen as a tourist because you think people are going to treat you a certain way or they're going to try to rip you off or something, right? So this guy's over in Russia. He's trying to fit in, and people continue to look at him and go, they know he's Russian. And he's like, what is it? So he talks to the people he's with, and he's saying, what is it? He goes, why is it that, he goes, is it my clothes that are giving me away? And the group of people that are with him, they huddle together, and they talk for several minutes. And they said, no, it's not your clothes. It's your face. And he's like, my face? Like, what does that mean? It's my face. And so they talked again, and one of the teachers that were with him quietly said, the difference is you have hope. At a time in Russia when there was no hope, his hope was evident and conspicuous, and people could spot it a mile away because most Russians didn't have any hope. Here's my question. Is your hope that conspicuous? Do people see it just exuding from you? Do they say, wow, that person has an anchor of hope in their life? There's something different about them because of something that's going on. I don't know what it is, but they can sense it. Is that the thing that anchors your soul? For me, I know this. Jesus is the hope that anchors my soul. Jesus is my advocate. Jesus is my mediator. He's my intercessor. He's my high priest. He is praying for me. He's forgiving my sins. He is pleading my case before God's throne as my high priest. Do you have a high priest that's pleading for you? That's your advocate? That's fighting for you? At the end of your life, when you stand before the throne of God, do you have someone to plead for you, or do you stand before God alone? Because if you stand before God alone, if I was to go before God alone, I'd be a wreck. Because my deeds in my life are not enough to get me into heaven. But I'm so thankful that I have an advocate who's going to speak for me and be my representative before God. And I know that my salvation is secure because Jesus is my advocate. Where's he for you? Do you feel that? Do you feel like, you know what, no matter what happens, Jesus is going to be my advocate? Maybe you don't today. Maybe you're here going, yep, he is. And that's amazing, and I'm so glad. But if he's not, I fear for you. Because one day you will have to stand before the throne of God, and you will have to account for your life. And if your life is anything like my life, you may not have much to account for. You know, well, God, I did this. I did these good deeds. And God's going to go, yeah, that's not good enough. But God, I went to church. Yeah, that's not good enough. But God, I tithed. It's not good enough. The only thing that's good enough is that you have a high priest who stands in the gap for you. And that's what makes you righteous. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, we are so glad, Lord, that you loved us enough to send us an advocate. You sent us a high priest who can intercede for us. And God, I pray that as we look to the high priest, as Jesus, as our mediator, and as our advocate, Lord, that you would anchor our soul in hope. Today, maybe you're as we continue to pray, maybe you're feeling like, I don't have that hope. I feel hopeless, and you want that hope. I just want to pray for you for a minute. Is there anybody here, you just say, I need some hope in my life? I just want to pray for you. And just raise your hand quick, and I'll pray for you. Yep, anybody else? Yep, over there. Yep, thanks in the back. All right. God, thank you for each person who raises their hand, Lord. They are looking for hope in their life. I pray, Lord, as they look to you as their anchor, Lord, that you would fill them up with the sense of that you are there with them. You will never leave them. You will never forsake them, and that you will stand in the gap for them, arguing their case. And we pray, Lord, that you would become the anchor for their soul. For the rest of us, maybe you're sitting here thinking, I've never surrendered my life. I've never put my faith in this advocate. I've never trusted Jesus fully, and today I want to make that happen. I just want to give you a moment. If you feel like I need to do that today, I need to make a complete life change, and I'm ready to surrender my life, and it's today's the day. Raise your hand, and I'll pray for you. Anybody, raise your hand, and I'll pray for you today. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. Let me pray. God, I thank you for this person who's raised their hand, Lord. They are looking for something different in their life. Maybe they've gone the wrong direction. Maybe they're headed down the wrong road. But God, I pray that this morning as they put their faith in you, that you would turn them back onto the narrow path. Lord, that as they seek you with their whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and they put their faith in your death on the cross, Lord, that you would not only atone for their sins, but you would be the one who advocates for them. Lord, for the rest of us, I pray that we would not forget that you are praying for us constantly, that you are cheering us on, that you want us to succeed in life, but Lord, most of all, you want our hearts. And so God, may that be on our hearts as we leave today, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.